spiky, and walking around their varied habitats with a swagger because of their atypical posture. Echidna are some of our planet's most unusual denizens, and are animals that are some of the most fascinating to still be living today. On a surface level regarding their appearance, they, alongside a range of other spiny mammals like hedgehogs, tenrecs, porcupines, and the lesser-known golden spiny mouse, all look rather similar and would be all thought to be closely related to one another based on their appearance alone. As we'll get into over the course of this rather long video, this is very much far from the truth, and they're all quite different from each other. In some cases, having split off from one another well over 170 million years ago, with Echidna being some of the most peculiar of them all. And so, to get an idea of just what these animals are, it is worth going back in time and looking into how they came about, and also how much their group has diversified over time, and how they are also actually more diverse than most would realise. Starting things off with their evolutionary history, Echidna are monotremes, an order of mammals today only represented by the platypus and also the 4 species of Echidna I'll be talking about today. It's generally thought that monotremes diverged from the marsupial and placental mammal lineages before these two then split off themselves, around 186 through 163 million years ago, which does help to explain why they possess many of the more basal traits that were present in the synapsid ancestors of these mammal groups, one of which includes egg laying. From there, these 3 groups went their separate ways evolutionarily, spreading across the world's continents and diversifies into many different forms. Echidna as we know them appear to have diverged from platypuses around 20 through 50 million years ago, and given that platypus-like monotremes predate this divergence, it does track that Echidna had aquatic ancestors that then went back to land and became terrestrial once again. This makes sense when looking at their anatomy, with them having streamlined bodies that allow them to cut through water well, alongside their broad and splayed hind limbs, which do have good rotation, which makes them quite effective rudders. In fact, Echidna have actually been seen swimming and are indeed quite capable of it too, with them being thought to both do it for leisure, to cross water bodies, and also to cool off. Those unfamiliar with these antics have been known to rescue these swimming Echidna, only for them to then head straight back into the water from which they came from to resume their activities. Their crawls are hollow, so that is also thought to assist them when they swim, as they are able to provide them with extra buoyancy due to the extra air they carry. Their long snouts also double as a useful way to keep them breathing without having to tilt their heads too much. Getting back to their evolutionary history, it has been brought up and discussed that Echidna evolved over in nearby New Guinea and not in Australia, which, as we'll discuss, well explains the general rarity in the fossil record, given the more forested conditions of the region means that fossilization is less common due to the more acidic soils and greater chances for disarticulation and/or scavenging, which is also backed by their current abundance in the area, where their diversity, to this day, remains the highest. What also makes it harder for Echidna and the history to be studied is that given that they're toothless, it means that one of the most important ways to determine relationships between mammal species is lost, with them being so important due to the tiny differences in structure being useful markers in seeing how they change across genera, as well as how long-lasting they are given the enamel and dentin that compose them. From the remains we do have of them, the oldest known fossil Echidna dates back to around 17 million years ago during the early Miocene epoch. While not having too much to go off of, what is there suggests that the traits of their bird-like snouts, with no teeth alongside their sturdy rounded frames, were already a thing even back then, and that therefore their body plan is one that has been around for a while. It's this early divergence from the rest of Mammalia that makes Echidna so unique, and also shows just how long they've been split from other lineages, including the ones I brought up earlier. To show just how radically divergent all of these animals are from one another, to begin, hedgehogs belong to the order of Eulepotophyla, which means that their closest relatives are the Solenodons, moles, and true shrews. Tenrecs belong to the superorder of Afrotheria, meaning that they're closest to animals that are some of the most radically different in both appearance and niche, even though they are all quite close phylogenetically to each other, like the hyrax, aardvarks, sea cows, and elephants. Porcupines are rodents, and so therefore are close to animals like capybara, beavers and mice, alongside the previously mentioned golden spiny mouse. So, with all this in mind, it's even more extraordinary to think that all of these mammals are all closer to every other placental, ranging from us, to whales, to cats and dogs, than they are to Echidna, which is intuitive based on when they diverged, but it is still quite crazy to think about, and is a real testament to evolutionary diversity among mammals. Getting back to Echidna in general, outside of the 4 living species, 3 extinct ones are known of, 2 from the genus Megalobullia, and 1 from the genus Ophthalmoglossus. The former genus dates from the Pliocene right up until the late Pleistocene, with them first being described from a left humerus in 1868 by Gerard Krefft, a scientist who was among one of the first few Australian scientists to support Darwin's position on the origin of species by means of natural selection, which can be a story for another time because there's a lot to go over there. Two species have been named, being M. ramseyii from late Pleistocene remains, alongside M. robusta from older Miocene sites, exclusively so far from New South Wales. These two species are often referred to as the giant echidnas, though they're actually not too much bigger than their living counterparts, essentially being similar in size to the western long-beaked echidna, the largest living species which weigh around 16.5 kilograms, though having the difference of having more extended forearms, with that title also being more fitting for the next taxon I'll be talking about. They also appear to have something which we cover in more detail later on, a diet which matches up more with the short-beaked echidna, in that their anatomy lends to them being more of insect eaters instead of worm eaters like the long-beaked ones. The other extinct echidna is Murrayglossus hacketai, which, being previously classified in the genus Zooglossus alongside all of the long-beaked echidna, was recently reclassified as their own genus in 2022 and were truly big compared to their relatives. Measuring 1 meter long and weighing around 20–30 kilograms, they would have been generally up to double the weight of the largest echidna alive today, which also makes them far and away the largest monotreme known to have lived. Their name fuses together both the last name of paleontologist Peter Murray, whose work on fossil echidnas for decades has been recognised through their name here, alongside the word glossus, which simply means tongue. Size wasn't the only thing that made them different to living echidna, as they also had more column-like legs that were longer than their relatives, something that would have likely made them more capable of navigating through dense forest, which was more plentiful back then when they were around. I've also covered Murrayglossus in more detail in a video I made exclusively on them, which you can check out here if you want to learn more, as they really are quite fascinating. Unfortunately for these larger echidna, they all went extinct in the late Pleistocene around 50,000 years ago, something which has been attributed to the increasing aridification across Australia. Thankfully, 4 species made it through this tumultuous time, but before going into them in more detail, it's good to get into the general aspects of their anatomy to see just what makes them tick. Echidna are very unique, both when it comes down to how they act in their environments and the roles they play, and they do have a mashup of traits that you would not usually associate with a mammal, ranging from their ability to detect electrical fields, alongside of course being able to lay eggs, alongside their spines and long snouts. So, in any case, where to even begin? Well, to start off with, getting their main monotreme trait covered, being their egg-laying capabilities, is certainly a good place to start. After mating, which is something which will be got into later, female echidna construct a nursery burrow, after which they wait around 21 to 28 days for gestation to finish. They then lay a single small, leathery egg about the size of a dime out of their cloaca, their multi-purpose hole. The egg is then directly transported into a tiny, backward-facing pouch on the underside of the mother's body, which is a temporary one formed by both the abdominal muscles and surrounding mammary tissue. The egg is then stored in this region for another 10 days, where after this time has passed, the tiny hatchling, only about 1.5 centimeters long, then emerges, assisted by their adaptation of an egg tooth to break out, after which they then crawl with their well-defined front limbs and digits to then attach themselves onto their mother's milk areolae. These are not nipples like in other mammals, as monotremes lack them, but instead specialised patches on the skin, which the hatchlings, also known as puggles, attach to. The puggles continue to feed and grow for around 2 to 3 months, whereby they ingest milk over this time period once every 2 to 3 days, being able to increase their mass by up to 20% in just one drinking session that can last about an hour. When puggles reach around 200 grams in weight, they eventually begin to get too large and spiny to remain in the pouch any longer, becoming quite an annoyance, and the puggle is then transferred from the pouch into a burrow, where they are then concealed while the mother forages. The composition of their milk changes quite a bit over the course of a puggle's growth, with the milk being a pink colour given the high iron levels and low levels of free lactose, which is quite different compared to other mammals. The solution is initially quite dilute when the hatchling first emerges, with it being composed of 2.85% carbs and minerals, 1.25% fat and 7.85% protein, with more mature milk on the other hand being a good deal more concentrated, with 2.8, 1.25 and 31% respectively. The protein levels continue to rise over time up until weaning, which is thought to be down to echidna needing the increased energy to form their distinctive spines through a process known as keratin synthesis, which is handy for them of course due to their protective nature, both from predators, but also Australia and New Guinea's dramatic weather. When the mother echidna returns, the puggle will continue to suckle until they are eventually weaned by about 6 months old, after which the young will then leave their burrow and the two will then go on their separate ways. From this point, echidna can go on to live pretty long lives, with one echidna being known to have been about 45 years old at the time of death. This is a wild one, by the way, and one captive individual was well over 50 by the time they passed away. The key to this long life is the slow metabolism they possess, which is caused in part due to their low body temperature, which rarely exceeds 33 degrees, quite a bit lower than our 37, and it means that they don't expend as much energy, meaning their internal systems take less time to degrade and function since they aren't being used as intensively like in us. When they reach sexual maturity remains a bit of a mystery across most species, though at least for short-beaked echidna, the most well-studied of them all, a thorough 12-year study found that they reach sexual maturity between 5 and 12 years of age, which is a fair bit of a range, with their frequency of reproduction being anywhere from once every 2 years to sometimes being once every 6. In the months leading up to and during the mating season, both male and female echidna will emit a musky odour, which they do by turning their cloacas inside out and then wiping them on the ground, secreting a liquid which is thought to be useful as an aphrodisiac. When they reach this point, echidna, despite being usually solitary, will join up in unique group rituals once a year around June through September. Up to 10 males can end up forming a line nose to tail, which has become known as the echidna train, where they'll all follow a female echidna until they're ready to mate. These so-called trains can last for well over a month, with individuals dropping out and rejoining over the period the train is active. When the female indicates some readiness, she will then lie relaxed and flat on her stomach, with the males then breaking up the train and digging a circular trench around her, with each attempting to push one another out of it. The males aim to compete for mating honours through this process, with the last echidna standing getting the chance to mate. The victor will then dig out dirt from under the spot where the female's tail is, then proceeding to lay on their sides and putting their tail under the female's, where at this point, mating occurs. Sometimes though, male echidna may also take a more, unsavoury approach, whereby they will wake up from their hibernations, more on that later, and will sneak into the burrows of still hibernating female echidna, which can lead to female echidna waking up and finding themselves pregnant. How mating is conducted is also something that is truly unique amongst mammals, and has garnered quite a lot of bemused attention due to how strange it all seems to be compared to what we're used to. This comes in the form of, the male's highly unusual penises, which are both bright red and strangely enough have 4 heads instead of the usual 1. Now, why on earth is this a thing, and what and how do they use them? Well, for a good while, the specifics of how the echidna ding-dong worked were elusive, as echidna are notoriously cryptic animals to both observe and track out in the wild, as well as in captivity, and so many questions were raised and proved difficult to answer. It wasn't until the early 80s, as an example, that echidna were found to have laid eggs in their pseudopouch instead of just into their burrow like platypus do, by biologist Peggy Rismiller, so knowledge on even some of their base adaptations is quite a recent development, as with many things in zoology. The male appendage has internal testes, alongside no external scrotum, which when erect is around a quarter of their body length. They also have penile spines, which are most well known of in cats, to help induce ovulation in the females, so the prickliness is even more extensive than just on their bodies. Another reason as to why it looks so comparatively unusual is that it is also not used for expelling urine, which they instead expel through their cloaca, which seems to have freed them up to have some more elaborate junk, which is something seen in other species that do the same. It wasn't until 2021 that a more thorough look at their members' anatomy was undertaken, which was largely in part due to technological limitations alongside other limitations regarding the ease of access in finding and monitoring them. Given they're also protected, scientists can't just go around picking them up and being invasive, and so instead, euthanized echidnas due to illness and or road accidents were utilised instead. What was known prior to this study was that echidna were only using 2 of the heads at any one time when erect, as well as being able to alternate them, something which was found out by the co-author of this most recent paper, Steve Johnston, which is highly unusual in mammals, but has been known to happen in some reptiles. Female echidna do have a 2-branched reproductive tract after all, so the additional 2 heads were confusing to say the least. While indeed seeming like a silly endeavour, echidna are well known in the conservation world in being quite tricky to breed while in captivity, and so better understanding them, especially when it comes to helping out the more vulnerable Papua New Guinean species, is very much a crucial endeavour. Plus, it's also just really neat. We need more knowledge in the world after all. In any case, this paper set out to understand just how and why Echidna were doing this, and some interesting results were indeed found. To find out more, the specimen's members were analysed through specialised CT scans, which while regular ones only detect hard tissues like bone, a coat of iodine lathered on top of them does the trick in enabling the soft tissues to be mapped out as well, allowing for their important internal structures to be examined. What was revealed was that the urethral tube splits below the heads into 2 separate tubes, which then split again to allow sperm to be delivered to each of the 4 heads, though this finding did not explain as to why only 2 of the 4 heads are used during intercourse. It was thought by the researchers that some kind of valve mechanism would be detected that would explain how they control the selective head use, but instead of that, it was determined that instead it was one specific type of tissue that was helping out with this. For context, mammal penises consist of 2 main types of erectile tissue, which is the corpus cavernosum and the corpus spongiosum, which both fill with blood to help maintain an erection, though the role of the former is predominantly to just maintain a rigid structure, whereas the latter helps to keep the urethral tube open for fluids to be better transferred. Typically, both structures start off as 2 different structures at the base, with the 2 corpus spongiosum structures merging into one, and the cavernosum remaining separate. In the echidna, however, at least in the more well-known short-beaked echidna that live on the Australian mainland, the cavernosum is instead merged while the spongiosum is separate, which appears to allow them to erect each half of their heads independently. In a separate experiment of a similar nature, this time with a living but anaesthetised echidna, it was found that they could ejaculate 10 times in a row without much of a gap as the pairs of heads were alternated. Why this is the case isn't fully understood at this point in time, though it is thought to perhaps give them an advantage over other males if more splooge can be released to nullify their competitors. Sperm bundles of around 100, all joined together at the tip of their heads, will also form a sphere-like shape and move together in a coordinated pattern, with a larger sperm bundle correlating to a better swimming form and speed. Like with the alternating penis heads, why they do this is still unknown, but it could well tie back to sperm competition if an explanation is to be given. Continuing on from their weird reproductive methods, something very much elusive about them is what noises they make, or lack thereof. For most of their known scientific existence, it was suspected that they must make some kind of noises, though there was never any solid documented proof. That was until September of 2023, when a paper was published setting out to answer whether they vocalised to communicate, or the few sounds that were ever heard, like sniffing noises, were actual forms of communication or simply being tied to their breathing and not having any particular function. What was found was that they only seemed to do it during the breeding season, where they were found to produce a range of sounds, which included bird-like cooing, grunts, as well as wheezes. These were recorded by the means of small handheld microphones, as well as placing a camera and microphone set outside the entrance of a commonly used cave, which was frequented by a numerous local population. These rare vocalizations that were recorded during the breeding season shows that they must be doing them under the context of being more reproductively active. Though still, this is very much a new field of study on them, and there's almost certainly more that will be found out on them as we continue to learn more. Another neat thing we've learned about them quite recently is that they, and a good few other animals, are actually fluorescent, and it's a trait that is very much more common than was previously thought. Research done on 125 mammal species, the specimen sourced from the Western Australia Museum's collection, found that nearly all of them showed some kind of fluorescence. 107 out of 125 species, or 86%, glows when put under UV light. These representative animal studies encompassed all 27 known living mammal orders, and also about half of all mammal families, and was most common and intense among nocturnal species, among which the echidna is classified under. They appear to glow under UV light as proteins in their fur and skin absorb the incoming radiation and then emit it as light into the visible range for us, which is why many of them appear a blue through green, with reds and yellows also occasionally being noted. In terms of why this is a thing, since most mammals can see in UV, these brighter elements of the body, like the lighter parts of echidna spines, may be useful for communication, being able to spot each other from the distance, and potentially even being used to deliver cues to potential mates or to competitors. It is also worth noting that if you have a UV light on you and want to try and see this out for yourself, it is best to keep in mind that UV can damage eyesight of nocturnal mammals, and in most cases, a red light works the best for spotting them. On roadkill though, that's certainly fine to do however. Their internal heat regulation and behaviours relating to that and their internal anatomy are a good next thing to move to, as it is also something quite unique about them. Echidna, along with platypus, have the lowest average body temperatures of any mammal at around 32 degrees Celsius, with them able to adjust their circulation by moving blood to and from their skin, sometimes fluctuating by up to 8 degrees over the course of a day. While they are able to be active during daylight hours, they aren't as well equipped to survive in heat as would be expected, as they both lack sweat glands and also don't pant, and so will often accommodate by being more active in the evenings or at night. They also don't have highly concentrated urine, which is a typical adaptation seen in animals that live in environments similar to Echidna to conserve water. This all brings up the question of why would an animal that lives in Australia be so seemingly ill-equipped to dealing with heat? In parts, this is down to their more basal monotremes ancestry, and so lack more of the specialised adaptations that come around in more derived mammal groups, though they do have their own ways of dealing with the harsh habitats that aren't seen in most mammals. Their snouts especially are able to provide a good deal of relief, with them having a bony labyrinth which allows them to better condense the water vapour in the breaths they emit. They also, funnily enough, use snot bubbles to great effect, whereby they'll blow the bubbles out of their nose, and when they burst, the dampness created then helps to wet the tip of their snouts, an area of their body which is high in blood flow and therefore circulates a lot around their body. Another strategy involves them belly flopping on cool and shady surfaces, which allows for heat to be dissipated through their movement, and also gets right to their undersides, which don't have the insulatory spines on them. Their diet also helps them out, as termites contain a good deal of water, with 147 grams a day of them usually being sufficient. In the opposite scenario of colder temperatures, Echidna do have the ability to undergo light bouts of torpor, which is an involuntary rest period that can last for a few hours, as well as full hibernation. They can drop their body temperatures all the way down to as low as 4 degrees, and lower their heart rate to as low as 4 to 7 beats per minute, way down from their 50 to 368 when they're normally at rest, and will also only breathe every 3 minutes, which is the lowest level of energy consumption for any known mammal. They'll begin to hibernate even though the weather is still warm and food available, which seems strange, though it does have some explanations. One is that they'll aim to maximise their foraging productivity by not exerting too much energy over the course of the year, as well as that they do so for reproductive reasons so that their young can develop more quickly. During their hibernation, they'll have 13 distinct bouts of torpor, which are then broken up by periods of arousal, which usually last around a day and a half in warmer periods, with males ending theirs around mid-June, while the reproductive females return to normal levels in July. Echidna are known during their sleep and hibernations to have rapid eye movements during their sleep, which tracks with them being able to dream, with their patterns resembling newborn humans, though only if the temperatures are around 25 degrees, which is why it was long thought that they didn't enter this state at all. The reasons for this specificity are however not known. Related to their cognition, their neocortex, the layers of the brain involved in spatial reasoning, sensory perception, and cognition, is also unusually large in them, making up half of their brain size, which is just 30% in most other mammals and getting close to the 80% in humans. Their average brain volume is 25 mils, which is comparable to a cat of the same size as them, and their prefrontal cortex is also the largest relative to their body size of any mammal known, which, with its function being thought to be used for planning and working memory, it makes sense that Echidna are a good deal more intelligent and analytical than was previously thought, and yet another example of animals' intellect being underestimated. When compared to humans, Echidna likewise do have a more heavily folded gyrencephalic brain, which differs markedly to the closest relative, the platypus, where their brains are largely smooth, and also have a thicker cerebral cortex with smaller and less densely packed brain cells, something which all tracks as a sign of a more neurologically advanced animal in the case of Echidna, though it's of course not to say that platypus are outright dumb or anything. Some tests and experiments have indeed been done to see how competent they are both with navigation and with memory, with some Echidna that were placed in a maze alongside a test on opening a trap door to access food, being able to remember their route both through the maze and being able to open said door over a month after they had first done it, which is a similar learning ability to cats and rats. Another neat internal system they have is their electroreceptive one, with them having around 2,000 electroreceptors at the end of their bills, which enables them to detect the electrical signals produced from the muscles of their invertebrate prey as they probe around with their beaks. Being 1,000 times more sensitive to these fields than humans, they have been also known to dig up buried batteries as well, with mechano and thermoreceptors also being useful for navigating their environments. With their aforementioned bills, they contain no teeth, but that isn't necessary when they can easily make up for it with their very long tongues. They're very effective in picking off ants, termites, worms, and insect larvae, with all Echidna species having the preferences as to which of these prey items they prefer. 6 inches long or 15 centimeters long, their tongues are well equipped to reach into nooks and crannies to better scoop out their prey, with them being extra sticky too. This stickiness comes from the presence of glycoprotein-rich mucus, which not only lubricates the tongue so that it can effectively move in and out of the mouth, but also to better adhere their food to them. They also have the ability to be stiffened through increased blood flow, which enables them to be able to penetrate down through soil and wood too, and with the ability to move in and out of the snout 100 times a minute, it means that they can pick up a hell of a lot of food, and quickly too. This ability is also actually what gives the short-beaked echidna their genus name of tachyglossus, which directly translates to fast tongue. When they retract their tongue, although they don't have teeth to mash up their food, they instead grind it down with hard pads that are found both on the rough side of their mouths alongside the back of their tongue. After they consume their food, their stomachs handle the contents a good bit differently to other mammals. It's for one, entirely devoid of secretory glands, as well as having a cornified lining resembling rough skin. It also has low levels of acidity, almost being neutral, with a pH ranging in the 6.2 through 7.4 range, being more similar to a cow's rumen in holding foods, promoting microbial growth. This whole situation is even more fascinating when factoring in the knowledge that they've essentially reverted back to a pre-stomach state, not possessing and no longer needing pepsinogens, which are produced by the stomach and are converted into the active enzyme pepsin, which is key for protein digestion. It turns out that the genes that code for these stomach acids and enzymes have appeared to have mutated out of their system entirely, which is thought to have been driven by both their diets and metabolism. Ants, being their main food source as already being quite acidic, are able to leach much of their nutrients out as they decay within the echidna, and with the evolutionary cost to maintain their presence and them just overall not being too necessary, especially as echidna don't really need to be rapid digesters given their behaviours and defensive capabilities. These genes, being entirely absent from their genome, also means it's highly unlikely they could ever obtain these genes back, as the genes that code for these stomach adaptations, their genetic instructions if you will, are now completely missing. Echidna could well regain these adaptations if convergent genes developed to fulfill the same functions, but with their already established niche, unless there's some big ecological pressure, echidna digestive tracts will almost certainly remain similar for the foreseeable future. After their food is processed, they will then evict their waste through 7 cm long feces, which is cylindrical and long in shape, largely being composed of dirt, mainly from anthill material that they've been digging in a few hours beforehand. To further assist their food finding and digging capabilities, their front limbs and claws are very robust and strong, enabling them to burrow and dig through objects with strong force. With extensive musculature, mostly around their shoulders and torso, they are very well adapted to break through dry ground and logs, to not only reach their prey, but also to make their burrows, which are both key for their shelter and for their defense. They can be so powerful that one was known to move a 13.5 kg stone, something which is over double the weight of an average echidna, and a captive one was able to move a refrigerator around the room in a scientist's house. This sheer power is down to how the musculature is arranged and proportions around their shoulder and body, with them having solid humeri which allows more muscle to be built around them, with their biceps connecting the shoulder to the forearm as a point further down than what is seen in most other mammals, allowing for concentrated power. Their back legs are just as neat, in that they give them quite the odd posture. They are not only splayed out to the sides, which is quite like many reptiles, and quite dissimilar to most mammals, where they typically go straight under the body, but the back feet also point backwards at a 180-degree angle. This baffles early taxidermists, who evidently did not think this could in any way be right, and you can see in many museums echidna feet being positioned in the quote-unquote right way, to correct what was thought to be either a mistake or perhaps an injury. The reason why they have this positioning is so that they are better positioned to brush away soil from them while they're burrowing, with them essentially functioning like a drill in order to dig straight downwards at a rapid pace, something which comes in awfully handy when needing to either quickly escape a predator or reach for hard to get food. This positioning also gives them the other unique trait of being able to contort their bodies to scratch themselves, being able to reach backwards, around, up, and over their backs. To help with this, the second claw on each of their back feet is extended in length, and enables them to better scratch into their spines so that they can groom themselves more efficiently. This ability to contort in impressive ways is facilitated by the panniculus carnosus, which is a massive muscle just beneath their skin which covers their entire body. By contracting various parts of it, they can quite easily make their bodies more malleable, both when it comes to grooming hard to reach parts of their body, and also for curling up in their distinctive ball forms when they're faced with danger, fronting any potential threats with massive spines that are difficult for most predators to get through. This is further assisted by them having one of the shortest spines proportionally of any mammal, with their spinal cord entering at the 7th thoracic vertebra, whereas in humans, for example, it ends at the 1st or 2nd lumbar. Continuing on, their spines are modified hairs, which covers their whole body aside from their faces, legs, and bellies, and offers them a good deal of protection not just from predators, but also from fires, where they can be melted off while still protecting their softer sides. Because of the prevalence of bushfires around Australia, echidna have developed over their time on the landmass a significantly increased tolerance to low oxygen and high carbon dioxide conditions, being able to drop the heart rate down to 12 beats per minute, 1/5 their typical rates, to conserve their oxygen intake at the bare minimum, so that the heart and brain can continue operating. This process is similar to what is seen in seals before they dive, so it's an adaptation that is spread across multiple different animal groups, even when they live in polar opposite environments. Getting back to their integument, the fur between their spines helps to offer them insulation, and echidna from colder parts of the range, like in Tasmania, have longer fur that in some cases can partially obscure their spines, with echidna in especially arid zones like in the outback having considerably less. On their bodies, they also can often carry fleas known as Bradyocyle echidnae, the echidna fleas, which are some of the largest in the world at over 4 mm in length, being found across the range of echidna populations aside from in New Guinea, where they have not yet been recorded. They have also been known in one occasion to have been found on a Tasmanian devil, with echidna fleas in large quantities being responsible for a type of anemia and even lymphoma, so they can be quite potent if they get a foothold. Moving on to their head anatomy, echidna have an interesting optical system where they have a corneal surface, the outer dome of the eye that allows light to enter and become focused through the lens onto the retina, which is hardened through keratinization, which is likely to protect them from any chemicals sprayed out by their insect prey, and also to protect them from when their spikes accidentally poke them in the eye, which has been noted before. Their eyes also have the neat distinction of possessing the flattest lens of any known animal, giving them the longest focal length, which, similar to primates, allows them to see distant objects quite clearly, though with a narrower area of the scene which is captured. Unlike most mammals, they don't have a ciliary muscle to distort the geometry of the lens, and therefore the focal length to allow given objects at differing distances to be viewed clearly, and their whole eye instead is thought to distort, so the distance between the retina and lens changes instead so that they can focus. Their visual capabilities are therefore not the best, and it is not yet known whether they can perceive colour. What they are known to see though is being able to distinguish between black and white, and can also tell the difference between horizontal and vertical striping. Regardless, vision is not essential to echidna day-to-day lives, as even blind echidnas have been known to live pretty healthy lives even with their vision gone. What helps with this is that their ears are sensitive to low-frequency sounds, which is key for them in picking up sounds made by insects underground. They have a huge macula which is very large compared to other mammals, which is thought to be used as a gravity sensor to help orient them while burrowing downwards so that they can maintain their posture and sense of direction. Their external ears are obscured by their hair, so it means that it's next to impossible for predators to grab them as a weak point in their attack, as well as for foreign material making their way into the ear. Getting into their taxonomy, there are two genera of echidna to note, being Tachyglossus, being comprised solely of the short-beaked echidna, T. aculeatus, and the genus Zyglosus, comprising of the 3 species of long-beaked echidnas, all of which are native to New Guinea. This classification was once, however, a lot more messy, as early taxonomists tended to describe new species based on what we now understand to be tenuous criteria, oftentimes from individual variation or morphological differences based on different regions. This was mainly the case for the short-beaked echidna, given how much they can differ across their diverse range of habitats, and interestingly the opposite for the long-beaked ones. In the long-beaked echidna's case, they were all considered as part of a taxonomic revision of them in 1969 as all belonging to the same species, being Z. bruggenii, with the note that there was still quite little information on how exactly more of them were potentially out there. This would come to pass in 1998, as a re-examination of all their known specimens led to a consensus being reached, where there were 3 species instead, being the eastern long-beaked echidna, Z. bartoni, the western long-beaked echidna, Z. brugeni, and also Attenborough's long-beaked echidna, Z. attenboroughi. This whole situation practically overnight completely upended their collective conservation status, as they were no longer just one single, widely spread species that was considered generally threatened, but one where all three were now known to be critically endangered and known only from a few localities. With the short-beaked echidna, there are also some uncertainties, as while there is currently thought to be only a single species comprising 5 subspecies, there could well be cause for a second to be described. Studies regarding their diets show that there may be 2 kinds of echidna in Australia based on this, as a result of having different skulls and beaks. Echidna of the mainland Australian continent are generally more arid-adapted animals, eating more termites and ants in comparison to those on Tasmania and on Australia's east coast, where they instead feed mainly on grubs. Continuing on to the specific species themselves, the short-beaked echidna are found all across the Australian continent, Tasmania, and south and northeast New Guinea, being generally smaller than the long-beaked echidna species at around 2 to 7 kilograms in weight, and being up to 45 centimeters long, also having more longer hairs present across their bodies. The 5 subspecies are all distinguished from one another both when it comes to their location and also in their spine variation, hairiness, and also from their claw anatomy. To know what echidnas are likely to be around your area if you're an Aussie yourself, T. a. acanthyon is found in the Northern Territory and West Australia. T. a. aculeatus is found in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, and Victoria. T. a. lawsi in the Highlands of New Guinea and potentially northeast Queensland. T. a. multiaculeatus on Kangaroo Island. And finally T. a. setosus being found on Tasmania and a few islands in the Bass Straits, north of Tasmania. They are fairly common across their range, the exception being in New Guinea, though this is mainly due to little being known about them there, and their population estimates are far less certain. This wide range, as I've mentioned earlier, actually makes them likely Australia's most widely distributed native mammal species, with them being fairly common in areas where there are enough hollow logs and bushes available for them to chill. They are generally very difficult to predate upon, which certainly helps in making their numbers and range what they are, though dingoes, snakes, goannas, alongside non-native foxes can all target juvenile animals, and can more rarely sometimes take the adults if they're determined enough. Trying to chow down on one, even after being killed or already dead, can be a challenge however, sometimes even a fatal one, as this parenti here found out, with the echidna's spines getting lodged in their throats, eventually making the lizard succumb to choking or starving to death on their intended spiky meal, the echidna still lodged in there. Getting into the long-beaked echidnas, these species are a good deal larger on average than their short-beaked relatives, also having a diet that consists more of grubs and worms than ants and termites. Long-beaked echidna, like platypus, also have a spur on their hind feet that's generally not considered to be able to deliver venom like how platypus can, occasionally try and contort their bodies to stab at researchers, with ongoing studies suggesting that they may also be able to produce venom at certain times of the year, though a lot of this is still poorly known. Western long-beaked echidnas have downward pointed beaks and short fur for comparison to the short-beaked echidna, as well as having less and smaller spines dispersed across their body. They also get to much larger sizes, getting up to 77.5 centimeters long and weighing up to 16.5 kilograms, which actually makes them the largest living monotremes. For reference as to just how big this makes them larger than some small gazelle species, and also about on the level of wolverines and some wallabies, so they're quite the chunky animals. Another difference comes in the number of their claws, where long-beaked echidnas tend to just have 3 claws on each of their feet versus the long-beaked echidna, which usually have 5. They are found across the Bird's Head Peninsula and the Foham Mountains of West Papua and the Papua provinces in Indonesia, being most well known from elevations of between 1,300 and 4,000 meters, currently being absent from the southern lowlands and the nearby north coast. They are listed currently as being critically endangered, with their numbers on the decrease through varying human disturbances like hunting and habitat loss, with them considered as a delicacy, though commercial hunting has since been banned as a response, with the trade-off of traditional hunting remaining a thing. Next up is the eastern long-beaked echidna, which are mainly found on the island's eastern half at elevations of 2 to 3,000 meters. When it comes to their claws, they differ from the other members of their genus by having 5 claws on their forefeet and 4 on their hind feet, also differing from them in being coated in dense black fur, which gives them some added distinctiveness. They are currently classed as vulnerable, which is an improvement from when they were once critically endangered, thankfully having the largest range across the islands of the 3 long-beaked species. Finishing up, the final species I'll be talking about in this video is of course the one with the name of a well-named naturalist attached to them, being the Attenborough's long-beaked echidna. Being the smallest of the three species, and them known to occupy what we know of, a tiny pocket of highland forest, around 50 square kilometres in the awesomely named Cyclops Mountains, though they are very poorly known. The least known and documented of the three long-beaked species, they were described from just a single specimen collected in 1961 by Dutch botanist Peter van Rooyen, with them since only being known from occasional reports from the local Yongsu Sparrow community, as well as indirect signs of nose pokes, holes in the ground left by echidnas after they probe for food. Aside from all of this, the only evidence of them that made us aware of their existence at all was that original crushed specimen, with the ongoing anthropogenic disturbances in their only known habitats raising concerns that they may well be locally extinct there, and potentially going in the direction of being extinct as a whole. They were identified as one of the top 10 focal species by the EDGE project, evolutionary distinct and globally endangered, as well as among the 25 most wanted lost species that is the focus of the Search for Lost Species initiative. To ascertain whether they were still alive or not, an expedition to the Cyclops Mountains in a partnership between the University of Oxford, the Indonesian NGO Yayasan Pelayanan Papuanenda, along with others, set out on a month-long expedition in November of 2023, some 2,000 metres above sea level, to not only aim to refine them, but also to document the wider area and to understand it better. The team involved set out to deploy over 80 trail cameras, making multiple precarious ascents of the mountains, climbing more than 11,000 metres, which is a good 3,000 more than Everest. Echidna are immensely difficult to track down and observe, given these animals are both not only nocturnal and live in burrows, but they also tend to be very shy, so getting any footage at all was a big gamble the team had to account for. Previous expeditions had struggled to reach much of the mountains, the reason being the belief of local Papuans that they are sacred. Referred to as the landlady, traversing the mountains is very much a sacred opportunity, and they must be maintained well. Working closely with and discussing the aims with the local villagers meant that there was a downside of not being able to go to some places, and others having to pass through silently. But overall, it was very productive, and the researchers got a chance to be guided through many of the most remote montane environments in the world, much of which has likely never had humans step through them at all. The mission was an extremely challenging and also dangerous one, with an earthquake happening in a cave system they were in, forcing them to rapidly evacuate, as well as one member, Dr. Davronoglu, breaking their arm in 2 places, another member contracting malaria, and one person shockingly having a leech attached to their eye for a day and a half before finally being removed at a hospital. The trip overall, however, was very much worth it, as, over the course of just a month, the team had discovered several new insect species, one of which included the discovery of a whole new genus of tree-dwelling shrimp, where it seems the high levels of rainfall and humidity in the region is sufficient enough for them to survive entirely on land. Many new species of arachnids, including blind spiders, harvestmen, and a whip scorpion, were also all new to science, all being found in a previously unknown cave system, where it was only found by one team member falling through a moss-covered entrance, thankfully being okay after doing so. This all also included the rediscovery of the Mars honeyeater, a bird lost to science since 2008, and all of these findings would have been much more difficult if not for the expertise and support of the Papuan guides, with their local knowledge and experience helping to both navigate the region and make clear of any dangers, as well as helping to form makeshift labs in the middle of the jungle with custom benches and desks made from plant matter. This, along with the Oxford team's scientific techniques, made for a supremely effective team that was able to accomplish all of this with a good deal of cooperation and hard work after a good 3.5 weeks of initial planning. Even with so many animals either being described for the first time or even being rediscovered, it is certain there is more out to discover, and in the meantime, the intention from the Oxford team is to name as many of these new species as possible after their Papuan guides, as far too often, undeservedly so, their contributions and work has been historically under-acknowledged and appreciated. Of course, the main animal that was set out to be found, the Attenborough's long-beaked echidna, remained elusive. So elusive that according to local tradition, this fact can play a part in conflict resolution. When disputes occurred for whatever reason, one member of each community would be instructed to find an echidna and the other a marlin, something which could take a generation. Once found, the animals were deemed to symbolise the end of the conflict, whatever it may be, and then relationships could return to the status quo in the respective villages. Of course, trying to find at least one in just under a month proved indeed to be very much a challenge, with the team not seeing the echidna the entire trip. That was until right at the end. On their last SD card from their camera traps that were put down, from their last camera that was collected, and also on the very last day of their expedition, there they were. It's not much, being 4 3-second long clips, but it was enough to confirm that these echidna were still living in the area and made an already worthwhile trip all the more special and important. This is the first time they've ever been photographed alive, let alone filmed, which is monumentous, with the news also being passed along to Sir David himself, who was apparently, quote, absolutely delighted, end quote, something I'm sure all of us also feel about this news as well. It is hoped that with their rediscovery here, the echidna, along with all of these other newly described species, can help make the case for conservation in the Cyclops Mountains, as they are not currently protected, and it is unsure just what numbers of these animals we're dealing with. This is a good segue into the final part of this video, that being on the threats they face. Of course, one of the main issues is due to how secretive they are, it is hard to ascertain just how well their populations are doing or what their exact range is. Despite their reclusiveness and fortified defences, they are still eaten on occasion by people, the scale of this being largely unknown and understudied. Their hunting has however been noted to have increased over time, and has caused a decline in many highland areas, and also around the hunting trails that are typically used to track them down, with one of the big reasons for this increase being down to an increasingly westernised culture, with dogs being useful companions to sniff out and find them. New mining and logging operations are also opening up in some remote areas, which also leads to habitat loss and further encroachment with people, something which has historically not been good for them at all. To gain some new perspective over what the situation is in the region, much of Papua New Guinea is under the tenure of over 800 distinct cultures, many of which have their own language. It is clear from this that parks and protected areas, as which is common in the rest of the world, would be legislatively and logistically a nightmare, with there being no central governments to either enforce or manage them. Large conservation organisations have in the past loaded the country with tens of millions of dollars into conservation in New Guinea. However, with little to show for it, it is clear that business as usual will not cut it. Instead, more grassroots and holistic approaches involving communities instead of sidelining them has proven to be a good deal more successful, with some landowners establishing an echidna conservation area within the Crater Mountain Management Area, with the landowners voluntarily agreeing not to hunt in the area. This has apparently led to a doubling in echidna numbers, which shows that abstinence from hunting can have beneficial effects, which also makes it easier for them to be researched when more are present. More directed and interconnected investment linked to local initiatives instead of broader efforts seems to be a winner here, and is already showing results. While the echidna in New Guinea still overall remain under threat, and there are many factors against them, our growing knowledge and relationship building with multiple communities is a bright light to keep note of, and it for sure isn't too late to make sure these unique guys continue on living in the ways they know best. When it comes to conserving and understanding the short-beaked echidnas and their situation, while they are much more common and widely spread than their long-beaked relatives, they too face a good deal of threats, and it's quite a range for them. While poorly surveyed and little being known on their demographics, it is known that the most persistent and common threats they face is both habitat destruction and motor vehicles, which can be so prevalent that local extinctions have even occurred. Over a decade-long period, for example in Victoria, it was found that 1/3 of echidna deaths that were reported to wildlife authorities was due to cars and other vehicles, something which also extended to wounded animals being brought in. In terms of a positive at least, studies have shown that they will, when presented with the option anyways, prefer to traverse drainage culverts under roads, likely because of their preference for darker and more enclosed conditions, something which has been noted as a viable means of reducing deaths on busy roads, where they remain quite common, essentially being the opposite of the wildlife corridors which allow for animals to pass overhead of busy highways. In the case of habitat clearance, short-beaked echidna are usually less affected than the other echidna species, since they don't require a specialised habitat, beyond just having enough termites and ants to feed on, as if there is enough cut down wood left over. The logs can be a great source of shelter for insects, which they rely on. In areas however where the land has been completely remodified or only supports single crops which are harvested with machines, such as wheat fields, local extinctions and large declines have been picked up on. Infections can also be a big detriment to them, as the introduced tapeworm, Spirometra erinaceropiae, is very potent. These waterborne worms get into their system from echidna drinking from contaminated drinking areas, which are shared with already infected dogs, foxes, dingoes and cats, which are not negatively impacted in much of a meaningful way by the parasites. This is especially dangerous for them in drier areas, as because more animals are sharing far less drinking areas, the chances of transmission goes up by a good amount. Other things to note include supervising pets, as domestic cats and dogs, while some of us may think they wouldn't want to go out of their way to harm them, have been known to, very consistently at that, so making sure your pets are either well leashed or kept indoors is also very important, both for the echidna's safety, but also for the pets to prevent them from getting injured by attacking them, and also in general to protect them from the other animals Australia has to offer, and the environment. Considering the infamous reputation Australia has, it's even more worth of a concern than usual, so definitely keep all of this in mind for any Australian pet owners watching. And if you're already aware, let others know, it's just good practice. Grabbing them also causes them stress, and can also result in them being injured through being accidentally dropped or contorted in uncomfortable ways, and they should only ever be handled under professional circumstances by qualified researchers or zoologists. When it comes to what populations are doing better, the best opportunity to see them, if you're keen to, is going to Tasmania, which has been stated by echidna researcher for 30 plus years, Dr. Peggy Rismiller, who has spent more time observing them directly than anyone else, where their density is well above what is often seen on the mainland. As an example, in a 1500 hectare study area, there are 209 individuals that are being monitored, compared to just over 40 over the same sized area on Kangaroo Island. Finally, while they cope well in captivity and aren't too fussy, breeding them is another story, which is mainly down to their infrequent cycles, with Perth Zoo in 2009 managing to breed some captive echidnas, and later on in 2015, the first ever zoo-born echidnas were successfully hatched. This recency of getting them to breed goes to show how much of a challenge it can be to get their numbers up in captivity, something which is a big concern if there were to be any extinction level events they contend with, and also if their numbers continue to decline as they have. Considering how important they are for their ecosystems, likely being keystone species that the rest of their environment relies on, in part because of their contribution to bioturbation, being able to rework and move up to 204 meters cubed of soil a year individually, which is crucial in determining what plants and animals can live in these regions, what with their creating of resource availability to other species. In conclusion, all of this is to say that echidna on the whole are profoundly unique and important animals, ones in many ways we are only really just starting to appreciate for just how strange and awesome they actually are. And I really hope that all of you watching who have got to this part of the video have got a newfound appreciation and fascination for these most funny of creatures after my 1 hour of ramblings. All in all, I thank you for watching this video on these animals and that you may have learned something new. If you would like to see more from this channel, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And with that, I'll see you next time, whenever that may be.